This is Dan Schneider. It's another show in our. Let me try that again. This is Dan Schneider. I'm here for another American TV with Mitchell Hadley. This time we're going to do another profile, and we'll do a second one later today. But right now we're going to take on Barbara Walters, a major figure in American television, American journalism, and for better or worse, American infotainment, as the word was coined. So, welcome, Mitch. Before we get on the Barbara Walters train, for those who don't know you, if you could give a little background about yourself.
Sure, it's good to see you again, Dan. I am a classic TV historian. I blog at itsabouttv.com where I write about the relationship between classic television, that is television from the 50s through the late 70s, early 80s, the relationship between classic television and American culture. And I also am the author of three books, two books of fiction, and a collection of essays on classic television called The Electronic Mirror, which is available at Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and all good online booksellers.
So, before we just start in with like the biographical background, let's just talk a little bit about Walter's impact. Because love her or hate her, it's undeniable that she probably in the top three or four most powerful women ever in the medium. Um, uh, Lucille Ball, Mary Tyler Moore, and then it would be hard to pick someone maybe definitively more influential. But uh, what is your take on Barbara Walters? Because I mentioned the term infotainment, and
Hmm.
Barbara Walters, even though she may have started out as a journalist back in the 50s and 60s when she was young, sort of got that reputation that, when she did interviews, for example, the Barbara Walters interviews, that she was softballing questions. She wasn't really holding people's feet to the fire. She was more about Barbara Walters and the celebrity aspect of whoever she was interviewing, even if it was a king or a head of state. What is your take on her and the whole infotainment thing?
Well, I think that's a valid criticism. It isn't always going to be fair because she did some very incisive interviews during the course of her career. But I think that, particularly if you look at her latter stage when she went off into The View, uh, if people only remembered her from The View, if that's all they ever think of her when they think of Barbara Walters, I think that would be unfortunate because she was, as you said, a trailblazer. But I do not think it is unfair to suggest that she lacked the hard edged news chops on a consistent basis. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. I think she was an outstanding interviewer in the celebrity area, whether she was doing her Oscar preview shows or her year end reviews or a lot of the interviews that she did with both celebrities and world figures. But having said that, when you look at some of the famous television interviewers of the age, Mike Wallace, for example, Edward R. Murrow. They both did the same kind of interviews. They both interviewed their fair number of celebrities. Nobody attaches the softball type accusations to them the way they do to her. And I think that while part of that probably is because she was a woman, part of it is that that was not her style to be confrontational, to be really riding on somebody. I would think of her more as perhaps a slightly more serious Larry King. But that's not to downplay the impact that she had in journalism and the impact that she had in broadcast history, as we'll get to. I do think, though, that you're right that the infotainment part of her career is probably for better or worse her more lasting legacy.
So she only died less than 2 years ago. She was over the age of 90,
Hmm.
but she was born right at the start of the Great Depression to Jewish parents, immigrant parents. Walters was the family's sort of, I guess, Ellis Island converted name. Oddly enough, I never realized that the family name was Warm Water, actually.
Hmm. Interesting. Yes, I think that when you look at her life, when you look at her growing up and you see her background, one of the things that is important in considering her future career is that her father was involved in show business. He had a lot of celebrities around. He was a booking agent, so he was familiar with them. Because of that, she was not in awe of celebrities. She was used to them. They were around the house a lot. They were in the nightclubs when she might visit her father. So she grew up around them, and because of that, she wasn't in awe of them. She wasn't intimidated by them. She had a level of comfort about them that was going to serve her well throughout the rest of her career.
So she did, just looking at some of the stuff in her youth, uh, I know when I've read of her, I thought she came from a bit more wealthy background, that she went to some of these famous boarding schools, but apparently I was wrong, because looking here, basically at the Wikipedia article, for better or worse, she did attend public schools through most of her life.
Yeah, her father lost his fortune, and so he had a nervous breakdown. He was in financial trouble constantly. They were having to borrow money to pay the bills. She was she made a comment once, and I think that's probably in the Wikipedia page as well, that she said that her mother should have married the way her friends did, to a doctor or somebody who was going to be able to support the family in that way. I don't think she's speaking ill of her father in that, but he did lose his fortune. And one of the interesting things about this is that one of her father's patrons, in a sense, was Roy Cohn, who was the legal counsel during the McCarthy hearings, McCarthy's right hand man. He was also a lawyer, of course, and he was very helpful to the family in a time when Walter's father was in the most dire of straits, helped out in expediting certain things, taking care of certain things. And because of that, she always had an affection for him. She did not jump on the bandwagon of people who condemned Roy Cohn, especially in his later years when he was in the process of being disbarred and when all of the most salacious details about his life were coming out. She didn't turn on him that way, and I think that's to her credit, but it's also a very interesting aspect of the background that she came from.
So let's talk about her career in television. We've talked in a couple of shows, touched upon the 1950s era of television, with the quiz show Scandals, and some other things. We did a show on the 1950s. And she was right there in New York, starting apparently at an advertising agency, working her way into local television, helping to run a children's television show, and then sort of working her way up to the morning show. What was it on CBS? Yeah, the morning show on
Yeah.
CBS in '55.
Hmm.
So she's right there at the beginning of the medium.
Yeah, she's in perfect position to take advantage of opportunities that would come up. And the fact that she was a writer and a producer meant that she had an ability to be able to back up ideas that she might have. If and that's fairly typical of people in the early eras of television, that the more skill you had, the more you were able to do, the better chances you had of making it. So obviously, by being able to interview people, by being able to write, by being a producer, she had a lot of skills that she brought to the table. And she moved eventually from the morning show. She did some work in magazines, and she wound up on the Today Show, and started out as a writer and researcher. And here again, this is an example of how in those days you were able to work your way up. This is 1961, but she starts out writing, doing research for the on-air talent. Pretty soon she's starting to do some features. She does particularly what were called in those days the women's pieces. And Today had a history of that. There was something they had called the Today Girls, and they were part of the show. They weren't just there for appearance's sake, but they concentrated on the issues and the newsworthy elements that were appealing to women. So you had, for instance, Florence Henderson, Lee Merriweather, Helen O'Connell, Estelle Parsons. They were all Today girls at one time or another. And Walters would wind up in that role. But she's also doing more reporting, and she moves on to becoming a reporter at large. She's doing some heavier type stories, a day in the life of a nun, a day in the life of a Playboy bunny, some things that are taking her out into the field and being able to do well-regarded stories that are airing on Today. And eventually she graduates to being on the desk on the news element of the show with Hugh Downs, her great friend, when Hugh Downs was the host of the Today Show. So for me, for example, growing up, my idea of the Today Show is Hugh Downs, Barbara Walters, and Frank Blair. Blair was the newsreader. And and then Joe Garagiola with features and sports. In fact, I think Joe Garagiola winds up taking on some of the lighter things that Barbara Walters would at one time have been thought to be doing. But that's the core of the Today Show throughout the early 70s. Then when Downs retires, Frank McGee becomes host, and that is an interesting turn for Walters. She and McGee did not have a smooth partnership. McGee came from a hard news background, unlike Downs. He was familiar to people from covering the space program, the Kennedy assassination. And when he becomes host of the Today Show, the show takes on a harder news edge than it had previously. And one of the things that he had written into his contract was that anytime he and Walters were doing a joint interview with a news figure, he was contractually guaranteed the first 3 questions in the interview. Now, I'm not a psychologist. I don't know if it was that McGee did not want to share the spotlight with a woman reporter, if he didn't feel that Walters had the hard news chops that were required for what he wanted to do, or if he simply did not want to share the spotlight with anybody. It could have been any of those things. It could have been all of those things, a combination. So I wouldn't say that McGee necessarily was what you might call a misogynist, but I do think that he and Walters did not have a smooth relationship as co-hosts, and even though she was not officially a co-host at that point, she is a visible face on the show. So that existed throughout the time that McGee was host of Today, and that lasted until McGee's death in 1974, when Jim Hartz becomes the new host of Today. Then Walters is formally introduced as a co-host. And if you look at the TV Guide listings at that point in time, rather than the way it used to be, where it would say Today, Hugh Downs, or Today, Frank McGee, it now says Today, Hartz/Walters. And that's a big change, both for her and for the program and for the news/entertainment genre in general.
Let me just back up a little bit because you had mentioned that she had worked at magazines, and I saw the main one was Red Book, which
Yep.
is a woman's magazine, and then you mentioned she had become a Today Girl or whatnot. Um, the Today Girls, they were doing what, light on air stuff.
Yeah.
They were just sort of there to look attractive or something. So
Well, yeah,
what
to look attractive and to report on things that were of interest to women.
and and like in later years, if she wrote, if she had a biography or whatnot, what did when Walters went from television to magazines and then back to TV over a
Hmm.
several year period, um, was that a turbulent part of her life? Was there some career crisis that brought her back to television rather? Because magazines traditionally have had a lot more feminine success behind them, feminine
Hmm.
female publishers, even back in the 40s and 50s.
Yeah. I'm not sure that there was a great turbulence. Nothing that I have read about. I know that she did have um, always had sort of a struggle with her own confidence and her own ability to feel comfortable on the air. Some of that is due to her own level of self confidence, some of it is due to the criticism that would come while she was on TV. You know, people making fun of her slight lisp, the Baba Wawa bit that they used to do on Saturday Night Live. And I think that those were things that hampered her. But I think that in general, she had worked on TV. She was interested in being on television. So I don't think that to my knowledge, I could be completely wrong. As a matter of fact, as I often say, I'm sure there's somebody out there listening to us right now saying, this guy doesn't even know what he's talking about. But I'm not familiar of a life changing or a traumatic event in her life that caused her to go back into television. I think that it was more like it was something that she could perhaps see that she wanted to be involved in, that she wanted to play a bigger role in, that it may have been her perception, as it was with many people at the time, that that was where the future was in television as opposed to magazines.
Um, you mentioned the Baba Wawa lisp, and that was, I think, Gilda Radner who did it.
Yes, yes,
Um,
it was.
now, she didn't have as noticeable a lisp as someone, say, like Truman Capote, who had the over the
Correct.
top gay lisp or whatever you want to call that. But do did she ever address that? Did she have like some ADD, or was it, because some people who've had those kinds of issues, you know, it gets back to some kind of, like, people who stutter a lot. Some kind of, did she have any kind of nervous condition? Do we know what caused that, or?
Well, I would say, with lacking any other information on it, it is conceivable that it was that confidence issue that she had that could have contributed to it. There was at one time, well, after she graduated from Sarah Lawrence, she was looking into getting into acting because she had been around so many entertainers growing up, and she had considered auditioning for a play, and she had backed out at the last minute. And one of the things that she mentioned later on in her autobiography was that she knew that in her heart she didn't have the courage or the confidence to face rejection over and over. And it is odd in a way that choosing the career that she did, where she went into news and became a news pioneer for women, that she would go into a situation that constantly put her in that facing rejection, not merely as a journalist, but as a woman journalist. So in a sense, she is really breaking out of character by going into television. She's taking on a challenge that that one might not think a personality like that would be suited for because of that. So it's very interesting, but to her credit, she goes through it and she becomes very good at it, very polished at it, and overcomes those difficulties. One thing I think we should mention, going back to the Baba Wawa thing, is that was not a cruel impersonation of her. There was always it was very soft satire, but unlike some of the things that Saturday Night Live did, or that other people would do, not only about her but about other broadcasters, and I think Tom Brokaw comes to mind because he also had a slight lisp. But there was nothing terribly cruel in the way that Radner portrayed her on Saturday Night Live. If it wasn't affectionate, and I think sometimes satire tends not to be, it was still very gentle. So it wasn't something that she would. It was something that dogged her, but it wasn't something that she might have taken personally as something that she had to address.
Yeah, and in those days, a lot of newscasters or people who were in positions like that were made fun of. Gene Shalit, who was the film critic, often had that sort of wild hairstyle that
Oh
people
yes.
was easily made fun of. Ebert was the fat critic. Siskel was the bald critic.
Yeah, it's a personality trait, or it's a physical trait.
Yeah.
Yeah, Gene Shalit always looked like he just stuck a screwdriver in a light socket or something, but he was very good at what he did, and he again is somebody else that should be included in that core group that begins to form on today at the time that Walters is there.
So by the late '70s, she makes history by becoming a co-anchor of ABC News, becoming the first woman,
Mm.
and she again had a rough go at it with Harry Reasoner.
Yeah, it's not I think a good move for her personally. Now I want to back up just for a second to set the stage for this. That while Walters was working on the Today Show, she also had a syndicated program that aired on most NBC affiliates either before or after Today, and it was called Not for Women Only, and it was a show that dealt with women's issues, but again, not just issues that pertain to women. It would be anything from sex to work, the workplace, how women relate into it, the effect that has on men, different things like that. But again, I think the important thing about that is that it's not a hard news show. It's probably more like The View, or at least how The View started, than anything else. But Walters begins to build some hard news credentials. She is part of Nixon's historic trip to China. She's one of the very few journalists that accompanies Nixon on that trip. The only female broadcaster and one of only three female journalists to go on that trip, and that probably gives her substantial credibility in working in the news. And so in 1976, ABC lures her away from the Today Show to join Harry Reasoner on the evening news. She gets $1 million a year for joining the news, which was unprecedented for anybody. Uh, it's not good because I don't think that in her heart of hearts she was a hard news broadcaster. But more importantly, it was not a good professional mix with Reasoner. Now, again, she stresses in her autobiography that there was never any personal animosity on Reasoner's part. He didn't have anything against Walters himself, but and I think that that is either very accurate or it's a very generous assessment on her part. But you have to remember that Harry Reasoner had started out at CBS. He had become a prominent newscaster there. He was more or less Walter Cronkite's designated substitute on the evening news anytime Cronkite was on vacation or on location. And Reasoner himself had gotten to the point where it looked as if he would never get the opportunity to succeed Cronkite. So he had gone to ABC in a big move, and he had become the co-anchor of the ABC Evening News with Howard K. Smith. Now, it's said that Reasoner really did not want to co-anchor the news with anybody, including Smith, although he did it for several years. And again, Howard K. Smith, journalistic chops, hard newscaster, nail. But when Reasoner and Walters go on the air together, there's no chemistry. Uh, there is no magic that people like Roone Arledge would be looking for on the evening news. I think icy disdain is perhaps an exaggeration. Somebody used that. Condescension, maybe you're getting a little closer there, but it wasn't good. And Reasoner, having within the last year become the sole anchor of the evening news, wasn't excited about the idea of having to share the desk again. So that was it turned out not to be a fatal occurrence in Walter's career, but it certainly did not turn out the way that she or ABC might have hoped it would. It didn't improve ratings. It was not a critical success, and it probably attracted as much derogatory commentary as it did complimentary commentary toward her. What she continued to be able to specialize in were those interviews. And in fact, the same year she joins the ABC Evening News, she debuts her Barbara Walters specials that she becomes famous for. And for an old newscaster like Reasoner or any of the old guard, despite again the fact that Ed Murrow had done the interviews as well on person to person, this isn't seen as the hard news background that you need to be anchoring the evening news.
ABC News in the late 70s, after the Reasoner Walters experiment sort of failed, they kept trying to have multiple anchors. I remember at one point they had Peter Jennings in his first go-around with Frank Robinson, the first black guy to ever host a news show. And then I think they had a third wheel on that next one. I forget.
Yeah, Frank Reynolds.
Right, Reynolds.
That was actually a very good news program, I thought. Yeah. But Walters was still a headliner on the news when they went to that format. They basically had Frank Reynolds as the lead anchor, Max Robinson with national news, Peter Jennings with international news, and Barbara Walters with features and interviews. So it presented them as a quartet, and conveniently they would split the screen into fours in showing the four of them as a team. But very shortly thereafter, I think Walters begins to take an existence outside of the evening news. She's doing her specials. She's having these newsmaker interviews, people like Jimmy Carter, Fidel Castro. She becomes known as the interviewer that can get interviews that nobody else can get. She's interviews Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat during the peace talks between Israel and Egypt. So she starts to carve out that niche, and that becomes what she is primarily known for today. The interviews, and some of them are very good. In fact, Walter Cronkite was said to have commented after her interviews with Sadat and Begin, did Walters get anything that I didn't get? Or did she pick up something that I missed? So she did win respect as an interviewer, but there again, one of the famous moments in her interview history is the interview she had with Katharine Hepburn, and that's where she, in context, she asks Hepburn if in essence, if there is life after death, If there is, if you can be reincarnated, how would you like to come back? And Hepburn said, I'd like to come back as a tree. And that leads to Walter's famous question, what kind of a tree would you be? And that's satirized on everything. They do a brilliant bit on Police Squad, even about it, where they're doing a ballistics test by firing a gun through VHS tapes of Barbara Walters interviews, and they're able to tell the caliber of the gun by how far it goes in. And this one, the ballistics expert says proudly, this one goes all the way into where she asks, what kind of tree would you be? So it becomes kind of a negative hallmark in her career. But on the other hand, as I always say, there's no such thing as bad publicity.
Yeah. Before we move on to the 2020 and how she got there, I mentioned how in the late 70s, it seemed all the three major networks were trying for some kind of Huntley-Brinkley kind of chemistry that had stopped. And then by the early 80s, we end up with the big trio that lasted 20 years, which is Rather at CBS, Jennings at ABC, Brokaw at NBC. But it would seem to me that making $1 million a year, that Walters could have had at least how did Jennings leapfrog, or did she take herself out of the running to be the sole anchor?
I think she was probably out of the running by that point, because having been, and I don't necessarily mean this in a negative sense, but having been relegated to the interviews and special features segment, I think that the only choices ABC would have looked at after the death of Frank Reynolds would be to either replace Reynolds with Peter Jennings, who had previously been one of the anchors on the evening news back in the late 60s, or going to somebody like perhaps Sam Donaldson, the White House correspondent, or going outside of the network altogether to attract another big name, Dan Rather, for example. So I doubt, I could be wrong, but I doubt that at this point Walters was probably seriously considered for that anchor role. She was doing quite well for the network with her Barbara Walters specials, which were very popular. She wasn't quite at the level that Diane Sawyer would be at a few years later, where Sawyer could do special primetime specials and interviews and still be a successful anchor on the evening news. And you probably can credit Walters for the making something like that possible for Diane Sawyer, but I think that that ABC was probably content with that. And then, as you mentioned, she moves on to 2020. She continues to do her interviews. She does the first interview with Richard Nixon after Nixon resigns. I know everybody thinks of the Frost-Nixon interviews, but it's actually Walters that is the first to interview Nixon after the resignation. So she's still making and breaking news with these interviews. She's still probably providing a pretty good return on the investment for ABC, even if it isn't the way in which they had originally hoped it would be.
Now, I remember, for some reason, I do remember the very first 2020 in 1978 or 79, whenever it came on. And the thing with that, I remember it was looked at as a third-rate 60 Minutes. It didn't.
It was a disaster.
It didn't have. It wasn't taken seriously with the journalistic shop. Occasionally, Geraldo Rivera or John Stossel might, expose something in a hard-hitting interview. But 2020 in the early, just a few years after it started, had the infamous thing where they investigated pro wrestling and Stossel got his clock knocked off. So wasn't that that a step back?
2020 needed a huge remake.
Yeah. Was that a step back for her though?
Well, I don't know. I don't know, because you look at 2020 when it first debuted, and that very first episode, if you saw it, and I saw it, and not many people did, and nobody would see it again, because the original hosts of 2020 were actually Harold Hayes and Robert Hughes. Mm-hmm. Harold Hayes was from the magazine business. Robert Hughes was the art critic for Time, and it was a disastrous show. I think the best review I remember of it. The best review was that it was dizzyingly absurd. And so the network, to their credit, took very quick action. We talk about shows that were canceled after one episode, and everybody thinks of Turn On, the ABC version of Laugh-In that was actually canceled for all practical purposes in the middle of its only broadcast. But after that first episode, uh, Rude Arledge sacks Hayes and Hughes, and he brings in Hugh Downs, the old veteran, brings him in off the bench. At the time, Hugh Downs had been doing a show on PBS called Over Easy, which was for seniors and in the transitional stage of life from working to retirement. And he's a pro. And he's able to calm things down and to give the show some credibility. Even so, if you look at my favorite reference book for television, which is the Complete Directory to Primetime Network Television by Brooks and Marsh, the first edition of that has 2020 going off the air after its summer run. 13, 26 episodes, whatever. It takes a break, but it actually isn't canceled, and it's still on the air today. That has a lot to do with Downs coming in and smoothing things out. And I think that Downs probably has something to do with bringing Walters into the show. They had worked together on Today. They were good friends on Today. And Walters joins the show in 1979, which is a year into its run. She's not the co-host at that point. She is a special contributor, I think they called her, a regular special contributor. And by 1981, she is the co-host. So she and Downs are reunited on the desk as the co-hosts of 2020, and they're on there for 15 years. It's a very successful run, and 2020 has become a profitable program for ABC. It never has the cachet that 60 Minutes has. As you mentioned, it goes through some really rocky times even after Downs takes over as host, but it becomes a credible show. It becomes accepted as the ABC version of 60 Minutes.
Yeah.
And I think you've got to give Walters a lot of credit for that. Hugh Downs was never a hard newsman. Downs was much more in the mold of somebody we're going to be talking about later, actually, Dave Garroway. Downs had been the sidekick for Jack Parr. He was the host of Concentration, but he was a very pleasant presence on NBC. And even though he wasn't a hard newsman, he did project the gravitas that was important to have helming the network's early morning news and entertainment show. So he's a good choice to save 2020, and I think Walters begins to give it some of the credibility as the show moves on that allows it to stay on the air and to continue. So I think there is probably a pretty good move for Walters and a good move for the network.
So the 1980s and 1990s would probably be considered the peak of Walters' powers. She's hosting 2020. She's doing the Oscar stuff. She has the primetime specials. By the end of that era, she's created The View, which we'll talk in a minute. But she's also done. She's probably seen as a higher grade Mary Hart in some way, who was from Entertainment Tonight. She would do these silly shows like the Most Fascinating People, which was the sort of TV equivalent of the People magazine Sexiest Woman or Sexiest Man or whatever.
Yeah, or Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous. Something. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And this to me at the peak of her power, in a sense, it seems like she's finally embracing that she's a light news celebrity interviewer kind of person.
And I think she embracing is a very good word for that, because I think at that point she understands what she's doing, and she's becoming very good at it. She wins a Peabody Award in 1995 for interviewing Christopher Reeve, and the Peabodys are pretty prestigious awards in journalism. So I think at this point she's finally being taken seriously as an interviewer, that maybe she's not going to be the next Mike Wallace, but she's going to do a good job, and she's still getting the big interviews. She is always in there battling. And in fact, she and Diane Sawyer, who are both with ABC, are becoming rivals to see who is going to get the biggest interviews first. But Walters gets Christopher Reeve. She gets Monica Lewinsky after the scandal with Bill Clinton. Uh, she asks Lewinsky a question about how are you going to explain this to your children, and Lewinsky says, "Well, I'm going to tell them mommy made a very big mistake." And Walter says, "That's the understatement of the year." So she's making news. She interviews Vladimir Putin, asks him straight out, "Have you ever ordered anyone to be killed?" And he says, "Нет." Um, so she is doing the newsmaker interviews. She is also, as you mentioned, she creates and hosts The View. By this time, in the year 2000, she re-signs with ABC for $12 million a year for 5 years. So she is the highest paid news host on television. And you notice that by this time they've changed the terminology a little bit. She's not a news anchor anymore. She's a news host. And that's different. And that's, I think, where she really has found her niche. And that's what she will be known as in television history. As a trailblazer, yes, but as far as her actual journalistic achievements, that's what it's going to be, that she is the interviewer.
Now, The View is an interesting show. I personally have never particularly liked it, and I'll get into
No.
that in a moment. But it comes on the heels of the very worst of the talk show genre. After Phil Donahue passes the torch to Oprah Winfrey, you get Geraldo, and you get these paternity tests shows, and Ricky Lake, and all of
Mhm.
these minor sort of scummy people. And The View, by contrast, even though it's not hard news, seems a little bit more serious minded. And within a few years after The View uh, debuts, a number of other these talk show hosts with a number of people that talk, these sort of midday women's
Yep.
issue type shows take over, and the Geraldos and the Ricky Lakes and the Jerry Springers all fall by the wayside. So in a sense, it's the slayer of the National Enquirer
Yep.
version on television, but it itself, I think, is problematic. What is your take on The View, and then I'll give you mine.
Okay. Well, the only times I ever happen to see The View are if I'm at the doctor's office and it's on in the waiting room, and invariably when my name is called and I come in and the nurse asks, "How are you today?" I'm always thinking, well, I'm not quite as good as I was when I came in a little while ago. I'll tell you that. I I I don't like it either. I think that is it's slanted, it's biased. It gives a platform to people that in a serious society would not have a platform. It's not cheap and tawdry. You're absolutely right about that. When you compare it to the shows that Maury Povich, for example, did, who ought to know better, or some of the other characters, Sally Jesse Raphael,
Yeah.
it's completely different than that. And in fact, if you look at those other shows, and they make any kind of waves, that's those shows would be profiled on a show that E used to have, which was called Talk Soup, where they would go through all of the various talk shows and present highlights from the day's programs. A very funny show, actually. But those shows would go on something like Talk Soup. The View actually had the potential to create news, whether it is in the opinions that are being expressed or the way in which they are being expressed. Now, as I say, I don't take it seriously at all. I don't think that a program that gives platforms to people like Joy Behar and Rosie O'Donnell deserves to be taken seriously. It's not the kind of a program that a serious society or a serious culture puts on the air. But and I would hate to see that be the lasting legacy of Barbara Walters. If that's all you associate her with, you've missed the point completely. But it's a success. It's still on the air. It's obviously still relevant to a good number of people on television, and it is influential, and it does make news. So what can I say? It's not my choice of programming, but then I'm not in the entertainment business either.
So for me, two words define the show. One is gossip, and the other one is apologies. It seemed to me that the show reinforced the idea that women when confronted with real issues such as the various wars America fought in post 9/11, or with drug crises or global warming, it just becomes a kvetchfest, sort of
Yeah.
women just talk about, we'll talk about these perfunctory things like global warming for 30 seconds, and then we'll talk about, Tom Cruise's latest whatever. And then and as far as the apologies, it seems that whenever they did stray into something deeper, one of the bubble-headed women who hosted the show would say something outrageous. They were anti-Semitic, or they were anti-Palestinian, or they were anti-Republican, or anti-gay, or this, that, and the other thing. And it seemed that they didn't even do any particular research. It's just, these are the 7 topics for the first 20 minutes of the show, and whatever came out, then you see Whoopi Goldberg issues a retraction or something and an apology.
I couldn't say it any better than that. I hate to think of what's been going on the last couple of weeks regarding Princess Catherine over in England. When you talk about apologies and gossiping, I hate to think of what they've been saying about her. And before anybody out there gets any ideas, do not tell me what they've been talking about. I don't want to know, but I can only imagine that they've been apologizing for the rumors that they themselves were spreading. But again, don't tell me, I don't want to know. I want to maintain my sanity. Yeah, I agree 100%, Dan, on that analysis. I think that it plays up these kinds of stereotypes. It damages the credibility that the guests had in the first place, and it becomes, in a way, it's the television version of internet clickbait. It appeals to our worst instincts as human beings. It appeals to our baser, lesser qualities to want to lash out, and it attracts that very idea that you and I have talked about before, that I mentioned earlier, this no publicity is bad publicity kind of thing, that they perform as if they would rather have you hate them than ignore them. And that's, I think, when we talk about the coarsening of American culture and of American society in general, this is the kind of a show that plays right into that but it's able to do it at a higher level than the tabloid shows that you mentioned earlier, and because of that, it attains a certain cachet that gives that causes people to listen to this show and actually take some of what these people say seriously, and it creates arguments, it creates confrontation, and God, you want to know why this country is so divided and there's so much animosity out there. It's because of shows like that. And I'm not, coming back to to Barbara Walters as our focus. Did she intend for something like this? Oh gosh, I would hope not. I know that Walters had her own personal biases and her own political philosophy. All journalists do. But I think that at worst you could probably accuse her of having a mild liberal bent during the time that she was on the Today Show, on ABC, on 2020, all of these kinds of things. She was always pretty good at least having a veneer of neutrality on this kind of thing. And I would hate to think that she wanted to see The View degenerate into the kind of program that it is today, because that does not do her well or her legacy.
So she died, as we said, in late 2022, just a couple of days shy of 2023.
Hmm.
It says dementia, so apparently, now I don't want to really get into her personal life. She had some interesting things. You mentioned Roy Cohn, her friendship with him. Apparently, from what
Hmm.
I'm reading, he helped her get adopted daughter. But so we mentioned Hugh Downs and her relationship, and a lot of the journalists who became names within the 70s, 80s, 90s uh, were people who started from that sort of soft background. The most obvious example is Mike Wallace. He was a game show host, and then
Exactly.
he moved on to interviews, which were serious with the intellectuals of the day. And even before 60 Minutes started, in I think '68, he was considered a hard journalist, and then famously people would say Mike Wallace's calling were the most terrifying words a corporation could hear. You know,
Yes,
so
exactly.
if we look at Barbara Walters, do you think that she could have been a Mike Wallace had she been male, or was it just her nature to be sort of a higher grade Mary Hart, if you want?
Good question. I don't know if she had the Wallace killer instinct in her. If she did, I think she probably shrewdly realized that in at the time in which she was coming into her own on television, viewers weren't ready for that kind of thing from a woman. And so if she had it, she shrewdly suppressed it. And I think that as her interviewing history went on, she probably found other ways of being able to get the information that she was looking for. When you talk about Walter's legacy, there are three newswomen that I want to mention that we haven't talked about on this show. Um, Ironically, they're all with ABC. They were all with ABC, although that has nothing really to do with it. But in the early 60s, ABC had a newswoman named Lisa Howard, and she was the first woman to ever host her own news update uh, in the afternoon. It wasn't she was a Barbara Walters type. She interviewed Castro in Cuba. She went and covered the conventions. She was involved in hard news, but she was also a very abrasive personality. She was not what Barbara Walters was. And Howard had a relatively short career on television. I think perhaps Walters looks at Howard and sees something that she should avoid in there. So again, Walters is not the first woman to do big news interviews. Lisa Howard gets that, but nobody remembers Lisa Howard. Then you look at Marlene Sanders, who was the first woman to do the afternoon news program on a network. People of my age will remember that throughout the 60s, the networks would have 5-minute news updates 2 or 3 times a day, in the morning, early afternoon, later afternoon, to cover anything that was happening before the evening news came on. And you had Edwin Newman, Floyd Calbert, Douglas Edwards. Marlene Sanders did the afternoon newscast on ABC. First woman to do that. And she was very good. She was a journalist as well. So Walters is the first woman to be on the evening news, but not the first woman to anchor a newscast, albeit brief. Again, Marlene Sanders is not remembered by many people today, although TV historians will remember her. Other people might know that she was Jeffrey Toobin's mother. But she does not live in the pantheon that Walters does. And then there's Carol Simpson, who not only is a prominent female journalist, she was a prominent black female journalist. And I believe, although I could be mistaken, Carol Simpson is the first woman to be the sole anchor of a network news program. She did the weekend news, or at least either the Saturday or Sunday evening news for ABC. Certainly it doesn't have the prestige of the Monday through Friday broadcast, but she's the first woman to anchor that kind of a newscast by herself. Carol Simpson, maybe because of recency bias, is better known than Marlene Sanders, and certainly better known than Lisa Howard. But is she as well known as Barbara Walters? No. So even though Walters is not strictly speaking the first in any of these categories, she is a trailblazer nonetheless, because she's the first one to do the evening news, the weekday evening news. She's the first one to have these primetime interview specials. She's the first one to rise to co-host on the morning news and to become a prominent female journalist. And when you ask about these today, she's the one people remember. I'm not sure, but what people even remember her more than they do Diane Sawyer.
Yeah.
She is so. Whether you like her, love her, hate her, disregard her, Barbara Walters is one of the trailblazers, without question, and she is one of the prominent newscasters, news show hosts in television's history. And for that, she will always be remembered and deserve to be remembered.
Yeah, and I was just thinking, other than Diane Sawyer, Jane Pauley and Katie Couric also followed in her wake.
Yeah, and I think, Katie Couric, you see some of the same trouble as you might have seen with Walters magnified, because Couric is the sole anchor of the CBS Evening News after Dan Rather leaves and after Bob Schieffer leaves. And she has trouble being taken seriously at all. So I would argue she didn't even have the journalistic chops that Barbara Walters had.
Yeah.
And you see what happened. Katie Couric lives in, I would say, relatively comfortable obscurity today. I don't know that she's on TV regularly. Maybe she's got alternative, podcasts or streaming or something like that. I plead ignorance on that, but certainly she's not in the Barbara Walters category.
Well, I guess that's a good place to end it. Always good talking to you, and we're going to record a show later today about another legendary figure from the early news era, Dave Garroway. So I'll see you then in a couple of hours.
Looking forward to that. Sounds good. Thanks a lot, Dan. Always a pleasure.